In this video, I will be showing you how to create a start menu in Scratch. So let's start. So basically in this start menu, we have the title with a nice turn effect, and then we have some animated buttons here. We have the start button, instructions button, and the notes button. Whenever we hover on the instructions button, it says use arrow keys to move. And then whenever we hover on the notes button, it says made by tekcoder. And when we click on the start button, our game starts. So let's start creating the start menu. So here is the basic game I have. It's just basically a cat moving around. So for this, what I'm going to be doing is, let's take a when I receive message block. Let's make a new message called play game, and then we'll put all this code inside this play game block. And then when green flag clicked, let's just take a hide block. You should do the same for all the scripts in this sprite, and if your game has more sprites, make sure to do the same thing in those sprites as well. So now for our start menu, let's just create a new sprite. Let's call this start menu. So our full start menu will be in this one sprite, and to achieve this we will be using clones. Each entity of the start menu will be in the form of costumes. So basically in the start menu we have the background, labels and buttons in the form of costumes. So the background is the first costume. We have a black background. The reason it's the first costume is because it's in the back layer. Then the second costume is the game title. The third costume is the start button. The fourth costume is the instructions button. The fifth costume is the notes button. And the sixth costume is basically the instructions label. So whenever we hover on the instructions button, it says use arrow keys to move. And the last costume is the notes label. So whenever we hover on the notes button, it says made by tekcoder. Now as I said earlier, we're going to be using clones. So let's start making the clones first. To start, we'll create a new custom block. Let's call this clone, and then let's add an input called hashtag, and then make sure to click run without screen refresh. Then let's take repeat hashtag. Let's create a new variable called id for this sprite only, and let's set id to 0. Then inside the repeat loop we'll change id by 1, create clone of myself, and then next costume. And then when green flag clicked, we'll do clone, and we'll clone the number of costumes we have. In this case it is 7, so we'll clone 7 costumes. So this script basically clones the stuff in the start menu. The id variable is nothing but the costume number of the entity. So suppose the background is costume number 1, then the id of the background will be 1. The title's id will be 2 as the costume number is 2. The instructions button's id will be 4 as the costume number is 4. Then the notes button's id will be 5 as the costume number is 5, and so on. Now this means that each costume has its id value. Also under this when green flag clicked, let's just hide and then switch costume to whatever the first costume is. In this case it's a background costume. And now let's do when I start as a clone show, and let's hide this id variable. And now as you can see, all our costumes have been cloned. Let's start off by positioning them. So under this show block, let's do forever. We'll check if id is equal to 2, which is the title label. We'll go to x 0 and y 115. This is for my case. This is basically the title's position. And then for the start button, which is id number 3, I'm going to go to x 0 y 30. Yeah, that's good. And then for the instructions button, which is id 4, I'm going to go to x minus 30. Yeah, that's good. And then for the notes button, which is id number 5, I'm going to go to x0 y minus 90. So basically there is 60 pixels gap between these buttons. And then for now I'm going to hide these use arrow keys to move and made by tekcoder labels. So what I'm going to do is, if id number is equal to 6, we'll hide, and then let's duplicate this. If id is equal to 7, we'll also hide. I'm also going to reduce the size of these buttons. So for now let's set the size to 75 in each button, and that works. You can adjust these values according to your start menu. Now let's add a hover effect to our buttons. So let's do when I start as a clone forever. We're going to check if id is equal to 3, which is our start button, or id is equal to 4, which is our instructions button, or id is equal to 5, which is our notes button. And then let's put it in this if then block. And then let's check if then else, touching mouse pointer, change size by, I'm going to say 110 minus size divided by 2. And then in the else statement, I'm going to replace this 110 with the default size, which is 75. Also make sure to remove these set size to 75 blocks in the other script. And with this we have a nice button hover effect. I'm going to reduce this 110 to something like 100, and that's much better. So basically this block just changed the size smoothly. I'll also add a nice brightness effect to the buttons. Let's set the brightness effect to something like 25, and then else we'll set it to 0. As you can see, it's much better. I'm going to set it to 15. Now let's add a tilt effect to our title. So let's check if id is equal to 2, which is the title. We'll create a new variable called tilt for this sprite only. We'll set it to 0 in the beginning, Then in this if statement we'll change tilt by 11, then turn cosine of tilt. As you can see, we have a nice tilt effect like this. Now let's focus on the instructions and the notes labels. So basically whenever we hover on the instructions button, it should tell the instructions, and whenever we hover on the notes button, it should tell the notes, and both of those labels will be on the bottom of the screen. To check if we are currently hovering the instructions button, we'll create a new variable called instructions question mark, and let's make it for all sprites. Let's set it to 0 in the beginning, and then here we'll check if id is equal to 4, which is the instructions button. We'll check if then else, touching mouse pointer, we'll set the instructions to 1, then else we'll set instructions to 0. So whenever we're hovering on the instructions button, the value of the instructions variable will be 1, and whenever we're not hovering, the value will be 0. Let's do the same thing for the notes button. We'll create a new variable called notes question mark for all sprites. Let's set it to 0 in the beginning. Then let's duplicate this. If id is equal to 5, if touching mouse pointer, we'll set the notes to 1, else we'll set it to 0. And then let's put it back in this forever loop. And it works for the notes button as well. And using these values, we will check if the label should hide or not. So if id is equal to 6, which is the instructions label, we'll check if then else instructions is equal to 1. So if instructions is equal to 1, we're going to go to x0, y minus 150 for my case, and then we'll show. Else if we're not hovering the instructions button, we're going to hide the sprite. And then for the notes label, we're going to check if notes is equal to 1, we'll show, else we'll hide. And as you can see, whenever we hover on the instructions button, it says use arrow keys to move, and whenever we hover on the notes button, it says made by tekcoder, which is the notes. Before we continue, let's add a clicking effect to our buttons. So if touching mouse pointer, we'll check if mouse down, I'll change size by 90 minus size divided by 2. And this gives us a clicking effect. Now the final thing to add in the start menu is to actually start the game whenever we click the start button. So for this, we'll check if id is equal to 3, which is our start button. We'll check if again, touching mouse pointer and mouse down, and then we'll broadcast the play game. And to delete all the clones, we're going to create a new variable called delete, and make sure it's for all sprites. If it's for this sprite only, it won't work. And then in the beginning, we'll set it to 0, and then here we're going to set it to 1. And then let's check when I start as a clone forever. If delete is equal to 1, let's just delete this clone. And now whenever we click the start button, our game starts. And that's how to create a start menu in Scratch. If this video was useful, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.